And that's why I teamed up with the experts future system.
Susie?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Chris Hodges, good.
Good afternoon.
Luann, Luann Waters, you're in Oklahoma?
Uh-huh. That's where I am.
Launch needed dash zoom for microphone today is big. Use escape. Zoom deep. Launch needed dash zoom dash Google Chrome. Launch needed dash toolbar. Click on this add button. Zoom meeting. Zoom meeting. Meeting information. More options with reactions. Record on this. Share screen. More options. Open chat. More options. Close combo. Start video. But audio set. Mute combo. Currently unmuted combo.
What is that?
Yvonne, there may be somebody on your participant. I'm looking at my participant screen too, and I don't know, it lists everybody, the 40 some people who are on now.
Yeah.
Maybe we can see who that accidental person talking is if you look thoroughly on the participant screen. It's 3:59, so we'll be starting in a couple minutes.
Well, once we start, we will mute everyone and so that our speakers don't have any interference.
This week.
And also I want to mention, oh dear, an echo.
You see the names on here?
Dan, is that yours? In any case, well, once the speaker starts, I will be muting everyone. And
I'm not connected to computer audio, it says.
and at that
Hearing
point,
aids.
You gotta have to plug in.
at that point, if you have questions for the speakers, if you put them in the chat box.
Yeah, and we'll have questions after the presentation by Eddie Red Eagle,
Right, and we can
Duncan.
circle back to that at that point.
Well, Yvonne, are we ready? It's 4:01. We
I
have,
think we're ready. So I'm going to mute everyone so that, and then Dan and Linda and Eddie and Jim will have to unmute themselves as going to leave everyone else muted so that we don't have any unneeded background noise. So here we go, and then Dan will start the introduction.
okay.
Ready to go, Dan?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our host is, it says LCTHF host, is Yvonne Keene. She's in Kansas. I'm Dan Sturdivant in Missouri, across the state line. We're certainly pleased to have everybody here for our program today, which is about the Osage at the time of Lewis and Clark. Our speakers are, you see his picture there, Eddie Red Eagle and Jim Duncan. Jim is C. Diaz there, Grenada. Welcome everyone. LewisandClark.org is the website for the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. Sponsors, let me stop the video. Sponsors of this program, please join our membership if you're not currently a member by going to LewisandClark.org and signing up. Our region sponsors are the Southwest region led by Philippa Newfield. Are you here, Philippa?
I am. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for suggesting this, Philippa. We appreciate it.
Thank you for collaborating.
Yes.
It's a force multiplier.
Yeah. So let's see, we have 52 people now. We'll probably have some more join us. And Yvonne Keene is the host of this program, and Gary Kimsey and Dan Sturdivant. So let's see. The recording has started, and I guess I'm ready to introduce Eddie Red Eagle. It's March 5, 2023, and we've got a great Lewis and Clark program for you today. Eddie Red Eagle and Jim Duncan present the Osage Nation at the time of Lewis and Clark. Yvonne, what else do we need to talk about here before we get going?
Are you going to introduce both speakers and Linda, and then we're going to start with Linda?
Yes. Linda Vogt, V-O-G-T, you'll see her on the screen. Linda, it's under Linda, is our first speaker today. Linda is a board member of the Southern Prairie Region, Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. She gives interpretive talks about the history of Clark's Hill, Norton Historic Site, east of Jefferson City, Missouri, and leads a volunteer group removing invasive plant species along the trail. Linda, do you want to go now, or do you want me to introduce Eddie? I can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself, Linda. Linda, you have to unmute yourself. Okay, I'll introduce Eddie Red Eagle. Eddie Red Eagle, Jr., an Osage Nation member, has been very active in all cultural and traditional Osage customs. Eddie served as an advisor to the Osage Pawhuska District and its drumkeeper in many positions in the Native American Church. A speaker of the Osage language, he served in the Osage Nation Congress and was instrumental in the establishment of the Osage Cultural Center. With a degree in business administration, he worked in the corporate sector for 32 years before retiring. He is a full-blood Osage. His family home is located in Barnesdale, Oklahoma, on the original allotment from the 1906 Osage Allotment Act. Eddie Red Eagle, he'll be speaking in a moment. James Duncan is an archaeologist, educator, author, and Osage scholar. He's served as the director of the Missouri State Museum and also exhibits director for the Missouri Department of Conservation. He has directed the department's 3-year statewide programming for the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial 2004-2006. He has co-authored Petroglyphs and Pictographs of Missouri, co-edited with Picture Cave, and published a number of articles on the Osage. Now lives in St. Louis, Missouri with his wife. So our speakers are Linda Vogt in Jefferson City, Eddie Red Eagle in Barnesdale, Oklahoma, and Jim Duncan in St. Louis. Linda, do you want to start?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
What happened? All right, why don't you just stick to this?
Can everyone see? Can you see that, Yvonne? Yvonne?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah. Clear.
Okay, I'll get started. Good afternoon. Our topic today is the Osage at the time of Lewis and Clark, and we appreciate your interest in this presentation. And I'm going to start by introducing you to a point in time and space in the Lewis and Clark journey through Missouri, Clark's Hill Norton State Historic Site. The expedition camped here for 3 nights. Now, this larger area was important to President Jefferson, in part because of its location at the confluence of 2 major rivers, the Missouri and the Osage, and it was also within the ancestral territory of the Osage. So the historic site, 14 acres, is managed by Missouri State Parks, and it commemorates both the Lewis and Clark history and the indigenous peoples' history. It features the outcropping, as described by Clark in his journals, where he conducted his observations from the bluff. And that area is located just before the overlook pictured in the center there. Well, my slides don't want to change. Okay. Also from here, you can see Dodds Island, which is now a conservation area, the hill called Côte Saint-Denis, and of course, the Missouri and Osage rivers in the fall. The photo on the upper left shows a lunette installed at the Missouri State Capitol titled Osage Hunters. It is reminiscent of the Osage presence once in Missouri. Now, President Jefferson had no reason to fear the Osage in the way, for instance, that the expedition was concerned with tribes further west. At the time, the Osage provided information on Missouri River tribes for the expedition. But Jefferson knew the Osage were a tribe to be reckoned with. He was aware of their war powers, as well as their control of the fur trade along the lower Missouri River for the previous 40 years. For the Osage, this conference could be seen as a gateway to the Osage country in western Missouri. And that's a phrase I borrowed from Jim Duncan, who's with us today.
I'm sorry, Linda, you need to speak directly into the speaker. Otherwise, when you're turning sideways, we can't hear you very well.
Okay, is that better?
That's better.
Yes.
Okay, okay. So this area, as you can see in this map, was on the path, both river and land, of the Osage movements through time, which you'll learn about later. Now, you know the Lewis and Clark story. So today's story just starts on June 1st, 1804, where the expedition camped for 2 nights on their way out west. Now, the picture on the lower left here shows where they encamped, which would have been on the lower part of the lower right part of this picture. And if you look to the back of this picture, all the way back, the bluff is in view there. And if you look at the very tip of that bluff, the overlook structure that you saw earlier was located right there, as well as Clark would have stood there. And the expedition camped on the Missouri River side. Now, the visit itself was uneventful. They sent a Pierrot across the river to pick up George Dewar, and Private John Shields, who had been exploring the North Bank. And in keeping with Jefferson's interest, Lewis walked about 3 to 4 miles around the site, and Clark climbed the bluff. And from the bluff of this view, Clark wrote, "I ascended the hill, found it about 100 foot high. On the top is 2 graves or mounds, a delightful prospect." And that's from his journal of June 2nd. Now, the mound that you'll see in the lower right here, the burial mounds are thought to be from the late Woodland period, which is 600 AD to 900 AD. And as you can see from this picture, they are not large. Now, I believe you're seeing one of the 2 mounds that Clark noted, both because of the location where it is, and a second mound just off to the right next to it. So returning home, they stopped here again on September 19, 1806. Today, the National Park Service lists Clark's Hill, Norton, as a high potential historic site on the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. I often refer to this place and time as a confluence of rivers and an intersection of cultures. Now, unfortunately, today, the ecosystem and the trail are somewhat degraded. However, the view is still a delightful prospect. And when I'm out there, the site retains a quiet sense of the peoples who once roamed it. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to the Osages. They're going to speak their side together. Edward Red Eagle Jr., who has been a great source of encouragement to me and the work at Clark's Hill, and to Jim Duncan, both of whom I have been very fortunate to get to know. They will tell you parts of the Osage story before, during, and after the expedition. So you ready, Eddie?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Linda. Appreciate it very much. First, I want to thank, am I,
Eddie, before you start, Linda needs to stop sharing her screen so I can get your slides up.
Okay.
yeah, Yvonne, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Am I coming through okay? Good,
Yeah.
thank you. Yes, afternoon. I first want to thank the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation for inviting the Osage Nation subject matter into your presence. I appreciate that very much. Along with the Southern Prairie region, your Southern Southwestern region, your Missouri, Kansas Riverbed chapter, thank you so much for inviting us. And the program coordinators, Gary Kinsey and Linda Vogt, thank you for your efforts in helping us. And this afternoon, Yvonne Keene will be helping me as we move through the PowerPoint presentation for our references to the various slides. I'd like to first see Yvonne, do you have the PowerPoint ready to come up?
Are you not seeing it?
No.
Oh. Well.
There it is. There we go. There we go. I think you've got it on presenter's view. There we are. Good. That's slide number 1. Yvonne and I will be interacting on the various slides, so we'll be talking to each other as we go through this. This being our first slide, slide number 1, is the reference to the status of the North American continent, approximately 1500, as recorded by various entities. But what I want to make point of is that in the North American continent, from the Arctic Circle, you go into the Middle Americas and on into South America, down to the Antarctica. This was populated and saturated with civilizations that were interconnected, working relationships throughout the eons of time, and up until the entry of current recordings or findings, of course, around the mound builders civilization. I want to make note, and you can see in your view where the Mississippi comes in and the area around Arkansas, Missouri, the St. Louis area. Note the placement of the Osage and those various tribes around the Osage. That is that waterway. If you wanted to pursue the westward movement, you have to come through that area, Missouri River, Red River, Arkansas River, in order for that efficient movement into the west. In that area, then, governed by the Mississippi, we're going to be talking about the Osage and the ancestry of the Osage. I'd like to take a moment and give the mic to Mr. Duncan for comments about the civilization that was coming into this time period of 1500 and the elements of that, and as it related to the prosperity of that civilization. So Jim, can I hand it to you for a few minutes?
You certainly may. Thank you so much, Eddie. And thank all of the audience and the organization, and especially Linda, for helping us put this together. At the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi River, where modern-day St. Louis sits, there were three large mound centers. The largest, of course, in the East, Cahokia, has been fairly well preserved and is now it's a World Heritage Site. It's one of only, I think, 12 in North America. The interesting thing about this area is there were between 15,000 and 20,000 people, all indigenous American people. And at the center of this, of course, were the builders were the Osage and their ancestry, which we will refer to as Tegia. These people began this site about 900 AD, and by 1050 AD, they had their maximum population supported by hunting, fishing, and agriculture. And at that time, this large mound group was larger than Paris or London as far as population. You have to go all the way to the Valley of Mexico in the south to find another archaeological site of this size. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Jim. We want to make note now on slides 2, 3, 4, and 5. And Linda and Yvonne will be moving into that slide cluster. I want you to take note of, as you look at the territories of Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, but take note of the waterways and the terrain. And I want you to realize that this area, Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas area, you're at the edge of the woodlands of North America, but you're also at the beginning of the Great Prairie. The movement then, as you see that area, represented that securities, the inhabiting into that woodland area up into the boundaries of Missouri and Arkansas, but then also the ability to move into the bounty of the Great Prairie that ran from the Texas all up into the Great Lakes. That bounty allowed the Osage and those Native Americans to go out into that, come back into the woodlands twice a year at least, and be able to sustain their livelihood. Take note that the Osage is recognized as the dominant people in this area, Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma, up until the time of intrusion. In that, then, the Osage has claimed the status of the sovereignty status in those areas, in that era, in that particular territories. So you see the land then, if it laid south of the Missouri, north of the Red, west of the Mississippi, and out to the Great Salt Lake or Salt Plains of Oklahoma, you are in Osage territory. I want to take note here, and Yvonne, let's move into the next cluster of slides, which would be slides 16, 17, 18, and 19. In this cluster of slides, what I just showed you, that domain of that space or territorial space, is extremely majestic. That 4-state area dominated by a people, how could they do that? What they did do in order to have that under their control, they have within their civilization the clan system. The clan system in the Osage world was made up of 2 divisions, celestial and the earth. And these slides exemplify the alignment of the clans and their placement in their particular activity. The clan system in this restricted population of the Osage did a number of things or allowed a number of things to happen through history. First of all, being restricted, the intermarriages of the individuals within the clans was restricted to clan. So over time then, all Osages have that relationship to each other. That relationship recognized by that word on that first slide in this cluster, Wahoin. Wahoin is that knowledge of who you are and who you are to your people. And in this, what this meant that all the clans in the two divisions, which were in total of 13 on each division, had specific duties that contributed to the whole. And in contributing to the whole, you awaken that power and that phenomenon we commonly refer to as synergism. All parts had to work together. And when they worked together, the whole or the total prospered. And that's what the Osage had and is still striving to retain in this current society. But it was a clan system that allowed them to control and dominate and claim sovereignty in the area that I just mentioned. Yvonne, let's move now to the cluster of slides 6, 7, and 8. And let's start with looking at the impact upon what I just described upon the Osage of the foreign intrusion. When you look at the movement in the Western movement, then you must come in that waterways. The efficient way of going westward would be the Mississippi, the Arkansas, or the Red River. The fur trade routes pursued that, and in that encountered, as you saw by the previous diagram, the presence of the Osage. In 1600s, the Spaniard enters into the picture. And by the 1700s, with their treaty of 1763 of Fontainebleau, where the Spaniard then conveys or sells that domain to the French, then you see that movement there from the Spaniard to the French. But I want to mention that the relationship of the Spaniard to the Osage was entirely different than the French to the Osage. And then at the time of the Lewis and Clark era that we're working into with Clark's Hill, then you see the Louisiana Purchase occur where Jefferson works that with France. And in that movement then, you see then what we're focusing on then, Clark's Hill and the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804. So in 1802, the Louisiana Purchase then brings that into the fold of the Americans, but it also then at that point in time begins the exit of the Osage and the French. So at Clark's Hill, that's a pivotal point in our timeline of the Osage, where you see Clark's Hill, as Linda just described, the confluence of the Missouri River and the Big Osage River. But you also notice on the other side on that map that Linda showed was the enclave called Côte-Sans-Dessin. That's a very important location in the timeline of the Osage, because that's where the French traders and French entrepreneurs that were with Choteau in the St. Louis dynamics set their enclave at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, and in their allowance to intermarry with the Osage. So they create the first generation of half-breed Osages. The Frenchman, the French trader, the French entrepreneur, and the full-blood Osage woman, who, by the way, was always a second or third daughter, never a first daughter. But that half-breed population carries that title even today in various families. But it also, we make note of that French Osage presence as we move into the timeline that's coming our way. The Yvonne, now let's look at slides 10, 11, and 12. If the previous cluster was the foreign intrusion, this is in the cluster of slides that exemplify the foreign impact. And in this view of these slides, you see then the element there of the impact of the Osage ceding or deeding away their land base. What we described of what they were sovereign in that 4-state area now is being turned over and negotiated with the Americans from the Osage to the Americans. In various treaties, the land base of Missouri and Arkansas is deeded away. The land of Kansas and Oklahoma, then that bottom strip in Kansas is deeded away. And eventually in the 1840s, that one area there of Osage County, which is the Osage Reservation, was the final domain or final land base of the Osage. From 1808 to 1825 on into 1840, that land base shrinkage takes it from a 4-state area to a county in Oklahoma. The political impact on this is shown in the 1800s to 1860. The French and the Osage forced out of this domain, but note that in all of the treaties, the French were the interpreters for the Osage in those negotiations. The lands of Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma shrink. Kansas is lost, and we move into the Osage Reservation. But please note that when the Osage moved into their reservation in Oklahoma, the Osage purchased that fee simple. We paid and purchased our reservation fee simple with our own revenue. What that brings to us is the intelligence that French Osage had in the times of the Osage with the full-bloods as they negotiate through those movements into what you see is the reservation or current Osage County. This is what we bought with our own monies. The Osage being the first tribe to have a trust relationship with the United States government. The cultural impact is also present here, and I want to notate this, and Jim may come along also with this. The fur trappers of the 16 and 1700s come into the area of the Louisiana Purchase, but they also bring the diseases. Smallpox, syphilis, tuberculosis, yellow fever. The Osage and the Native American, the indigenous people then suffer the pandemics in those areas, just like we encountered in ours. In 1700, it's recorded that the Osages vacated the shores of the Mississippi and moved inland into the inner Missouri area on the Osage River to get away from that human traffic that was bringing disease. What that era exemplifies also, that in order to control and sustain a domain of that 4-state area, you had to have at least a population of 200,000 people. When the Osage came into this reservation in 1840 to 1860, there was only 2,000 Osages that were on that original allotment roll. That is the impact and the reason we could not hold on to that domain, because of the impact of the disease from the European population. Yvonne, let's now look at slides number 13, 14, and 15. And I titled this little cluster the Osage. This is the view of the Osage that the French and the Spaniards saw in the first Americans when they encountered in that window of time. This is the Osage. The Osage had the size, as you can well see, large structured people, heavy protein diet. 7-foot Osages was common. I'm 6'2", 6'3". I would be below average in height and size, but a 7-foot Osage was common in that era. We also had the numbers. Jim quoted to me the other day that it is recorded that at a certain point along the Kansas River, Osages could put in the field 1,200 warriors. So we had the numbers in population. And we also had the advantage in logistics. We knew that domain from the eons of time. And Jim, could you comment on the pandemic of the day as they impacted the Osage?
Thank you, Eddie. Yes, I can. The pandemics began quite early, and the Osage suffered just prior to Duteen's visit in 1719. And by that time, they were down on the 3 parks of the Osage in that large village below what they call the Blue Mound Day. Their numbers were reckoned by the French to be about half of what they had been 2 years previous to that time. So smallpox was absolutely a terrible thing. And then just prior to the 1808 treaty that you were talking about, Eddie, there was another terrible smallpox epidemic. And at that time, the Maha, which are close relatives of the Osage, lost 90% of their people. They were still up on the Missouri, and the Osage in turn were somewhat decimated again. So as you say, numbers dwindle. And sadly, when you don't have the number of warriors needed to defend your territory, others can reckon and acquire, particularly the United States government, who promised to protect and equip the Osage.
Good. Thank you, Jim. So we can all appreciate that now with our current experience. But at one time, the Osage was dominant, had the advantage, and then that was decimated and the movement started. I want to note that in that movement, yes, the pandemics and did their terrible, terrible damage. But another effect of the intrusion and the impact of the foreign impact is that they took the Native American, including the Osage, out of nature. our culture, as I noted in the slides with the clan system, it's built in and with nature. That's the linkage into the theology of the worship of Almighty God and his creation. That creation relationship to mankind is exemplified in the Native American. When we, being mortal men, mortal people, put on the elements of nature, color, feather, design, hide, sound, those elements are iconic points of contact of creation and the hand and consciousness of God. So here you see in that picture in front of you, a Osage with those iconic elements on him. So that's two people, the mortal man of the mortality of man and the spirituality of man represented in those iconic elements that in his consciousness and beliefs connects him with Almighty God. Today, that theology still carries into our ceremonies. This is a picture of Lewis Burns, uncle of Jim Duncan, who still today in ceremonial was still wearing those very same type articles referencing nature and our connection to nature. Our theology was bound to that as by the divine word of God. When that was extracted from us, it put us into great difficulty and great handicap. So I want to wind up with that and turn it back to Linda and the group. I enjoy this. I feel like I'm talking to old friends. We all have the Lewis and Clark experience in common, and open it up for back to the coordinators. Thank you very much.
Eddie Red Eagle, that was great. Thank you. And Jim Duncan. Yvonne, what do you want to do?
I don't see any questions in the chat box, but I don't know, and I don't know if Linda has any final comments before we open it up to questions. Certainly, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box, or we might have a chance to have more open discussion in a little bit. It gets a little chaotic, of course, with everyone trying to talk at once, but drop your questions into the chat box. We can pose those to our speakers, and then we might have some open discussion. Linda, do you have any final notes to make on this?
Just that I'd like to thank Eddie and Jim for the presentation. I think you did a good job.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yes, that's a great honor.
I'm interested in the concept of foreign intrusion. You talked about that pretty substantially, but I want to hear more. The phrase itself is interesting. Foreign intrusion.
When you look at that as the movement, the element that first comes on, first of all, we were restricted civilization as all Native American tribes were. And that within that restriction in that domain, we had our civilization, our religion, our culture, our traditions, and more specifically, our language. And within that, we were all centered, and I always say that all Native American tribes are the center of the world. We see ourselves like that due to that restriction that we kept that purity of our civilization within ourselves, and we could move with that and prosper and grow in relationship with God nature, ourselves, and the outside. Foreign intrusion burst that and come on, and we were weakened by the pandemics, and that started the demise of those civilizations. So intrusion then is the element that began that. There was no stopping it. There was no defense by the Aboriginal. And we were at the wheel of fates of those events. And I give great credit to our ancestors in our full blood tribe capitalizing on the intelligence of the French that intermarried to work that best relationship, best efforts to get the remnants of that civilization move through time and areas and settled in Oklahoma. We cannot discount that, and we cannot overlook that.
Thank you.
I have a few questions now in the chat box. Thank you all. Doug Lindquist asks how much, he's saying that he floats a lot on the Ozark rivers, and how much did the Ozark or the Osage navigate the rivers? Was it a large part of their culture?
Oh, I appreciate that question, because that was the point that I had skated over, and I really wanted to capitalize on that. Osage is not our official name. Our tribal name, what we call ourselves, is Neogashka. 4 syllables, Neogashka, Neogashka. Translated into English, it tries to say children of the middle waters. Yvonne, if you could try to find that slide, it's in there somewhere in the up towards the front, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You'll see in there the waterways. Within here, if you look at it in enclosed, restricted area, within that domain, you have all the food you need, all the security, all the comfort. You have your people. You're safe. You're like a child with your parents at home. You just got through eating. You got your warm clothes on. Your tummy's full. You're safe, and you can play. And your parents are looking over you. That's the interpretation of Neogashka, and that derives from the children of the middle water. So those waterways, the word Osage word for water is ni, but actually ni translates to mean life. Water is life. So within this domain was the total, absolute, near Garden of Eden for the Native American. Total security, total safety within that. Hence the interpretation, children of the middle water, Neogashka.
Perfect.
That is something that man missed. And we're paying the penalty for it now. So I'm really glad you asked that question. I could get that worked in. Thank you.
And Ron Watson wants to know, how did the transplant of the 5, quote, civilized tribes affect the Osage territory in Oklahoma?
That occurs in 1815. Jackson moves those folks, those peoples out of the East Coast over to Oklahoma. Forced move, Trail of Tears. We all understand that. We were already there. That was our ancestral land. We were the sovereigns. That put us in a political induced conflict. It was not friendly. But we and the Cherokee and the five civilized were forced into that. Too many people in a small area, what's going to happen? Conflict. Not our part. We did not do that against each other. We hold no grudges to the five civilized tribes, nor do they hold to us. That was forced upon us by President Jackson. And that the result of it caused human conflict. And that's the penalty, another penalty of foreign intrusion. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, Chris Hodges asks that it says that he believes the Osage were pushed west by the Iroquois and the Shawnee. Is this movement part of the Osage lore?
Wow, good question. Jim, can you expound on that and take us back up the Ohio to Detroit and on into Appalachia? And wow, what a question. Love it.
Thank you, Eddie. The Iroquois, I hate to say this, in the 18th century, and when they were at their best with their guns, particularly Dutch and the English trade, they did not have enough persons to cross that Mississippi River. And they in turn warred with what we call the Illinois people, Illinois. Illinois. People pushed out of the southern Great Lakes region after 1640. And the Osage granted them safety and allowed them to, remnants of the Illinois Confederacy, to live on the other side of the Mississippi. The Iroquois never crossed it. I heard a story when I was young from one of the anthropology professors that the Shawnee also included remnants of many southeastern tribes, which had been reduced by disease, as Eddie has talked to us about. And they really didn't have any fight, so to speak, or any aggressive tendencies to confront the Osage. And in the case of the Spaniards, who were not very friendly to the Osage Nation because of their political power and their numbers in the 18th century, and we find governors Miro and others inviting some of those remnant groups to come into Missouri, ally themselves, and try to help the Spanish confront the Osage, who the Spanish thought were much too powerful. The Spaniards never got into a shooting war, so to speak, with the Osage. The Osage were much too powerful. And of course, by the time the Iroquois were forced into the Kansas Indian Territory, the Osage were south of them. And secondly, the Iroquois were much reduced because part of them had to live in Canada because of their loyalty to the crown. So neither one of those groups ever had any aggressive encounters with the Osage to amount to anything. And the Osage were known as gentle people. Now that's a surprise, but in the size like Strike Axe and some of Eddie's relatives, they were very large men. Some of them so large they didn't actually ride horses, they stayed on foot. And as warriors, of course, well armed, they were very dangerous to confront. Daniel Boone told a good story about that, what he had to do to save a group of salt makers. So what Eddie has said about that is absolutely, there's no doubt. The Osage, the Gia as a group, were the most powerful people west of the Mississippi, east of the Rocky Mountains. And they did have a large 4-state area, almost to the border of Colorado, under their control.
have a
I'd like to dovetail on that question. Jim mentioned also in there the Catholic religion and the practice of the Spaniard and the French. I want to give credit and give acknowledgement that in this union or this relations with the Spaniard and the French, they both bring the Roman Catholic religion, various forms, various methods, but they bring that. And what was amazing is that the Catholic stayed with the Osage from the 1600s all the way into the 17 and 1800s. Our trek out of Missouri up into Kansas and into Oklahoma, we were accompanied by the Jesuits, the Sisters of Laredo, and our Missouri exit. They were with us in Kansas at St. Paul and on into the Osage Reservation and established schools for Osage children. But I want to make note, when you're in St. Louis, the first school for girls was established by the Sisters of Laredo at St. Ferdinand's on the shores of the Mississippi at St. Louis. At St. Ferdinand's, the first school for girls was for Osage girls west of the Mississippi. That was the first school for girls. The key and the boys was down in further south of St. Louis for boys. So the very first education schools for children, Native Americans and children, was by the Catholics to educate the Osages. That has never stopped. That theme of education with our people, our people sent the children to those schools during that trek out of Missouri and Oklahoma, and still did it even to today. The theme of education was taken by the Osage, delivered by the Catholic, and it has never let up. The Osage population can rightfully say we are highly educated people, have had every opportunity for education and every encouragement of education by our people. What our people told us said, you're going to have to learn to talk like them, act like them, work like them, interact with them. You're going to have to deal with the American. Remember, you're still Osage, but you're going to have to do that. In other words, you're going to have to get an education. And they forced us to go to school. We had no choice. We didn't know why we were going, but they made us go to school. Thank goodness they did. So the Osage is a highly, highly proficient people today through the field of education in various elements, but it was a Catholic that brought that, and they stayed with us that whole way. And note, the Catholic never did try to discourage our cultural practices. They left them intact because they saw the symmetry of the monothesis, the honoring of one God, the true God, and his son, Jesus Christ, and the cross. All those elements are in the culture of the Osage, and they existed in the Roman Catholic, and that symmetry held true then, and it holds true to today. Thank you. Good questions.
Thank you, Eddie. There's a question about Pierre Chateau and the fur trade with the French. Any comments? Let's see, Chief Whitehair was close. Comments about Fort Carondelet. Chief Whitehair was a frequent house guest with the Pierre Chateau family.
Pierre Chateau, and Jim, you'll get some of this also. Pierre Chateau and Laclede that settled St. Louis did that with the union and the relationship of the Osage. There you bring the purity of the French Osage relationship. Shoto, in his interaction in the fur trade, that monopoly that he possessed, and the relationship with the Osage, they were dominant in that flow of the fur trade through that channel from the west into St. Louis and on into the great seaports. So the furs that were wearing around the necks of czars and kings came from the rivers of the Missouris through St. Louis, and that relationship with the Osage interacting in that chain and supply chain. Shoto was key to that and intermarried with the Osage. And in his last days, they ridiculed him because he dressed Osage, and they thought he had lost his senses. When I saw that, I said he was reminiscing how lonesome he was for what it meant to be with the Osage and what it means to be part of that culture. So Jim, can you come in behind that?
Yeah, Eddie, that's beautiful. There is a silhouette on display in the History Museum right now, and a display in I think down in the basement, that shows Auguste Shoto with, he's wearing Osage moccasins with a top hat and a fine frock coat. The French were called by the Spanish the Illinois traders, and they maintained their relations with the Osage through trust. It was a program of mutual trust, as Eddie has been telling me all along. The French and the Osage trusted one another, and that goes all the way back to the days when the Osages helped the French to raise the siege of the little town of Detroit, at that time called Pontchartrain. And that was an amazing thing. The Osage took an army of about 3,000 warriors in 1716 and raised the siege of Detroit. Sac and Fox and their allies had laid siege to the town, and the Osage helped the French raise the siege, and that friendship prospered. And they always trusted one another, and the Osage accepted the Jesuits. And another little surprise that Eddie's been talking about, and he didn't tell you about this, but the Jesuits were taken out of North America because they were considering a reduction. And you know what that meant. They were wanting the French king to allow the Osages to establish a nation. And they were taken from North America in the middle of the 18th century because of a proposed Jesuit reduction. They recognized the Osage as noble, trustworthy people, and they were going to try to have a reduction and actually organize an Osage state to be recognized by the King of France. And for that, they were taken from North America. The Osage were great people, honorable and trustworthy, and they never forgot the French.
Jim, I'd like to also dovetail on that. I'd like to mention to the folks that when the Osages were in St. Paul, Kansas, the chiefs at that time wrote a letter to Pope Leo. And it was written in Latin, but it was spoken in Osage. They spoke and had a letter sent to Pope Leo for the canonization of the Blessed Katera Tekakwitha. We were already pushing for her sainthood in 1825, 1830, with the request to Pope Leo, the Pope Roman Catholic Pope in Rome. Can you imagine? And that's how close the Osage and the Catholic, the French were. So very good questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie and Jim. We have a question here from Philippa Newfield, and by the way, we have someone, at least one attendee from every time zone in the continental United States. So we've got coast to coast participation today, which is wonderful. Philippa, who is in California, says that Eddie uses the descriptor half-breed. We have used mixed parentage and mixed ancestry as a descriptor. Is half-breed a descriptor only, is a descriptor only Native Americans can use, or should it be used in general parlance?
That's a very good question. I have yet to hear other nationalities claim that. But the Native American does do that, does claim that half-breed, quarter-breed identity. But let's first step back. Blood quantum is a United States government practice, not a Native American practice. The government brought that on in trying to identify who's Indian, who's not, in their quest to diminish the Indian count. But for the Osage, half-breed is an iconic description of those families that go back to Cote Sans de Seine at the confluence of the Missouri and the Osage River. That confluence there, that location, that residence held all of the named families of French intermarried that was active in St. Louis and being asked to exit out of there. And they located at Cote Sans de Seine across from Clark's Hill. And that's why we need to historically recognize that, because that's the point of departure where that relationship of French half-breed and Osage moves westward into Oklahoma. That relationship we're feeling the benefits of that today. And we don't realize how well the Osage handled that, because a lot of tribes may shun that intermarriage. The Osage didn't do that. We accepted that and looked at that not from a nationality standpoint, but from the offspring, the children, because now those children are related to that full-blood Osage and to that French and members of the tribe. And that's how we passively keep that in our people's population and still functioning today. And so when we're forced to try to identify who is an Osage, our people chose that if your ancestor walked into Oklahoma in 1906 and could establish their relationship back to Cote Sans de Seine, you're an Osage. That's all they have to do. Those individuals were called original allottees. And you had to state your relationship, why you're Osage, and they all went back to the areas of Cote Sans de Seine and retain that identity as tribal members. And we're one of the few tribes that do it in that manner, but that's how close we were in that harmony of that relation of Osage and French.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eddie. Dan, we've crossed the hour here. Are we at a point where we need to wrap up? Dan Sturdivant, you're probably muted.
Yeah, I think we probably have a couple more questions. At least I have a question. Let's talk about the Protestant. Well, the thought is that Indian school, where the Native American culture was denied, was so, Eddie, you talked about, at least among the Southern Prairie people, the Osage, that was the Catholics were permissive, if I understood, of the Native American culture. So was it more a Protestant religion deal that eventually tried to get the Indians out of the Indian culture?
The Osages that attended Jim, help me here, that school in Pennsylvania.
Carlisle, Eddie.
Carlisle. The
Carlisle.
Osages that attended Carlisle, when they came back home to Oklahoma, they established a Carlisle Indian Club. The harm by the Protestant in their management of that was there. I'm sure it was. That's been documented. But the Osage that went there came back with, I don't want to say fond memories, but I think they came back with the lesson learned of trade, nursing, printing, the labors required, and the true message of those schools was try to teach them trade. That's an admirable effort, very much admirable. The Osage capitalized on that. Those Osages that come back did not protest. They encouraged their offspring, their children, which I am, get an education, learn to work, go to work, contribute, take care of your families, all those things coming through that. So that how we address that Indian school situation, we have to tread softly and respect the other tribes. But the Osages, in their thrust to encourage education, would take their children to Carlisle and escort them to school. And if they run away and run home, they would escort them back. They would take them back. So that kind of thing. But I want to make note also, in our dealings, in our trust relationship with the United States government, the money that was used to build most of the Indian schools in the United States was done with Osage monies that we accumulated in our trust relationship in those land sales, deeding away that domain, created revenue. We didn't get that the next day. The government, in their wise ways, held on to it, and they used that money to build all the Indian schools in the United States. We eventually got that money back in the 1920s, but it took a Supreme Court battle, but we got that money back. Yeah. So good, very excellent questions. Thank you.
And there are other questions, and I'm just wondering if there's a question here about, is there a way for our participants here today to contact Eddie and Jim and Linda if they have additional questions that they'd like to have? Is there some way that we can manage that, do you think?
Yeah. Linda, could you coordinate that for us? Could we use you as a point person?
I'd be glad to, Eddie.
So
Okay,
Linda, if you could put your contact, maybe an email address or something, whatever you'd like to use, in the chat box, and then And then people can note that, and if they have additional questions, then you can field those and forward them to Eddie or Jim for some follow-up.
I'd be glad to do that.
Yeah, if you
Thank
can
you,
just
Linda.
drop that into the chat box, then everyone will have access to it for additional questions. This is great information, great questions, and we really appreciate everyone's participation. I think we had about 57 people on the call today, so a great deal of interest in this topic. Certainly. So Linda has put her email address in, or a phone number in the chat box.
Can
And
everyone see that? Because I've not been able to see some of the other chats.
We can't see any of the chats
Okay,
um,
yeah, I can't.
because
see
it's a
any.
webinar.
oh, it's a webinar. Well, I thought I could send, can I send it to everyone?
I'm trying to type it in.
Well, what if I do it? Is that, that doesn't work. Okay,
LSV.
You could put it in a document or share your screen or something.
yeah,
I think I've got it in here. Let's see.
but does everyone see it? I think that's the question.
There we go.
It's there now.
There's Linda Voigt's email address. You see the AOL.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'm not, by the way, Eddie, both Eddie and Jim, I'm not giving out your phone number or email. So these will all go to me and I'll forward to you as needed. Okay.
Okay, good. Yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Linda.
And can you confirm, Linda, that this AOL address that I typed in here for everyone is correct?
That's correct.
All right. So Linda Vogt has an AOL address here in the chat box that I posted for everyone to see.
LSVG1.
LSVGT1.
LSVGT1.
At AOL.
Running us down with a look at the one start to the work week ahead. Already talking about the work week. I know.
Okay, so we've got some background noise now. All right. So Dan, are we ready to
I think so. We're ready to close.
close up?
Thank you very much for allowing us to be included in this great program.
This was a good program.
How can we get a recording of the program?
Well, we are recording this program, and I believe, I don't know if there's editing that has to happen after it's finished. And then with Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation has a YouTube channel that all of our, well, eventually all of our recorded programs will be posted on. And I don't know, Gary Kimsey, if you're still on the line and can unmute yourself, can you give us any additional information about the YouTube channel?
Well, it's going to be on the probably the Missouri Kansas chapter YouTube channel, but it will also be on the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation YouTube channel.
Okay, so you'd look at YouTube and you look under Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, and you look for March 5, 2023 Osage, something like that. So that would be Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. Then the Missouri Kansas Urban chapter is Lewis and Clark KC. Lewis and Clark KC.
Correct.
So eventually we'll get that up, and Linda, we will also use you as the conduit when Yvonne works on that with. So,
Sure. Yeah, I can do that.
well, it's good to see everybody's smiling faces, and that was a great presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. It's great to
Thank
see
you.
you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very
Thank you,
good.
Yvonne, for doing this. Yvonne,
Yes.
you're great.
Bye.
Simply
Sweet.
She's
great.
the best.
Thank you.
Great group.
It's a lot.